Thank you. For those of you that don't know, I'm on the Lenoir City Council. I'm actually Mayor Pro Tem. I'm in my 3rd term there. So I've been on the Lenoir City Council now. I'm in my 11th year. So,
Yay! Libertarian success story.
Few and far between, but we got to start someplace. So, I've given some talks before, so this will be covering some of the territory that I've covered in the past. Basically, I'm going to talk about my experiences being both running successfully for office and then actually serving in office, and some of the lessons I've learned and some of the pointers that for those of you who are considering running for office, you might want to keep in mind if you decide to run for office. The basic thing that, and we've probably figured this out by now, is that there's no secrets or magic bullets to getting elected. There's nothing magic you're going to be able to find that's going to trigger something to get you elected. I don't have any linguistic or persuasive tricks the way you see some speakers talk about how if you talk about this way, you'll get people to agree with you or anything like that. I just have my own personal experiences. Don't have any fundraising miracles. Most of the fundraising I've been able to do over the years has been from family and friends, and then also some help from the Libertarian Party. I think when I ran for City Council, first time in 2003 when I was actually on the ballot, the party helped me out, which was a big help. And frankly, I hate raising money, and I hate all the accounting you have to do, and I hate all the campaign finance reports you have to make and all the disclosures. Those are incredibly annoying, and for those of you that run for office, you probably know that. Every time I've run, I've been my own accountant. I've regretted it every time. I need to get someone else who can be my campaign finance director, even whether I put it off on my wife or somebody has to do that instead of me, because it drives me crazy. No, it can't be my wife. She'll hate me by the time it's over too. Oh, really? Okay. Well, there you go. See? So it won't be my wife. And that's why I hate the campaign finance laws. It's easy to run afoul of them. So the way I did it the first time I ran, and the other 2 times after I've been elected, getting reelected was easier. But basically, and each time I've done this, I've relied on friends and relatives to help me out on the campaign trail. Particularly, what was incredibly helpful was having someone, either a friend or a relative or whoever it may be, at every polling place in the city of Lenoir, so that there was someone there handing out materials. I had campaign signs that I prepared, and I should have brought one with me, but that I've used every time, which is basically he knows it's your money, which is a little phrase I came up with that actually has people still remember now, even though I don't use the signs as often, because it's been again fairly easy to get reelected, which has been nice. So the other thing I did, and I did this the first time, but again I haven't had to do it since then, was I had radio ads that I actually had a professional radio guy do my radio ads. I drew up the language, and then he recorded them for me, and those were very effective. Of course now, obviously, the internet would be very helpful to have a website and that sort of thing. And if you don't have a website, you're pretty much out of luck, because that's the way. First thing anyone's going to do when they hear about you is type your name into Google or something and look you up. And if you don't have a website, they're going to be kind of adrift. So some of the issues that I've run on over the years, and I'll go into these in a little more detail as we get along through this, is I've run on issues. Initially, the big issue for me was involuntary annexation. I had been involuntarily annexed into the city back in the late 90s, and once that was final, I ran and eventually did get elected. That's sort of become a dead issue now. The legislature changed the law on involuntary annexation a few years ago, and cities just don't do it anymore. It's too much of a hassle, which is great. That's one of the few things that having a Republican legislature has been good about. They've actually got rid of involuntary annexation. I've also run and had a lot of success in opposing economic development incentive grants, opposing state and federal grants almost entirely. There are a couple of exceptions I'll talk about. Zoning and land use regulations, I've had success in running on those as an issue and opposing them when those issues would come up. Of course, no taxes. That's pretty easy to just take a position on no taxes, but I'll get into some of the difficulties of running on a platform of no taxes, which presumably, or no increase in taxes. We all want to cut them, but that finding a majority of a council that's in favor of cutting tax rate is kind of difficult. But at least opposing every tax increase, which I'm sure we would all do, actually running on that as a viable position is a challenge, and I'll discuss that. And then I've also, most local officials will oppose unfunded mandates, but I think it's also key as a libertarian to oppose funded mandates as well. Any mandate from the state or federal government that comes down on local government, I think, is problematic, particularly federal ones. Federal mandates, whether funded or unfunded, I think are absolutely wrong. And then there's also, although it doesn't come up very often, the issue of Second Amendment and gun rights has actually been something I've had some success in. So those are the issues I've run on, but then actually getting into office and governing from that position and being in a position where people respect your opinion is a challenge. A lot of people say when they talk to libertarians when you're not in office, they say, oh, it's easy to say no. Anybody can say no. And that's true. It is easy on its own to say no. But once you're in office, saying no and then offering an alternative of some kind is really, really difficult. If you say no and offer an alternative, it's incredibly hard. And I'll talk about that. For one thing, if you're the only, and this happens all the time for me, I'm on the losing end of 6-1 votes all the time. And so it'd be easy to just vote no and lose 6-1, but I have to be more prepared than anybody else on there because it's just me. And if I'm going to take a position that people are actually going to listen to and respect, I have to have done 6 times as much work as anybody else. In fact, some people, and I guess we as cynical libertarians probably aren't surprised by this, but some of my fellow officials were surprised when they found out that I read the agenda packet all the way through, read every line of it. And when there was some big proposal for a new set of regulations, I actually went through all 20 pages of the regulations and marked through stuff I had problems with and that sort of thing. And so it's made the rest of them have to work harder than they would have otherwise. Well, actually, they do. Actually, they respect me for it. You know, they say you've made us have to do our job better than we would have before, because theoretically they could just let me have my say, do the vote. I'd lose 6-1, and they'd move on to another point on the agenda. But if they did that, after a while, I think the public would probably ask them, you know, he's raising these issues, and you guys aren't even responding to them in any way. So it's made them work, and actually, like I say, they don't mind it. They're like, well, you're right. This is what we ought to be doing. And several of them have said that when they go through the agenda packet, they sort of know where I stand, and so they'll go through and they'll say, yeah, I know what TJ's going to say here. What's my counter argument to it? So I'm making them do their jobs better, not just making them do more work, but they're actually having to be more prepared than they would have otherwise, which I think is good. Awesome. So in addition to being prepared and reading everything, the other thing I have to do is go beyond what's in the agenda packet and research. And thank goodness for the internet, as I'll get into on some of these issues. If it weren't for the internet, my job would be much harder to do the research I need to do to support my own position on issues. And I'll get into that specifically on some issues that we talk about. And again, it's easy as a libertarian to say, oh, regulation and taxation are bad and I oppose it and we don't want any new laws and we need to cut. But you have to be ready to offer alternatives. You have to ask why something's being done. And when you get the answer, you have to say, well, what about this as another option? So that you're not just as some folks call me, council member no, but you're a council member that actually has some ideas that most people haven't heard before. And the other thing, and this comes from my background, for those of you that don't know, I'm an attorney. I've been an attorney now for 20 years. My background as an attorney, for me, it's rarely, I won't say never, it's rarely personal. So, you know, they know that for me, it's just I'm willing to have a fair discussion with them, and if I lose the vote, I'm not going to pout and go sit in the corner and say, another 6-1 vote lost. I'll move on to the issue and live to fight another day. So they know it's not personal. I know it's not personal. And so even though I disagree with them the majority of the time, we do have a very good relationship. I have a good relationship with everyone on council. I am mayor pro tem, which in Lenoir means you're elected as a council member. But every 2 years, the members of council, by majority vote, elect someone who will be mayor pro tem. The mayor pro tem presides over a couple of meetings and stands in when the mayor's not able to. So even though I lose a lot of votes, by the majority of council. This is now my third year I've been mayor pro tem, which again shows that the rest of council does respect me even if they disagree with me. So that's good.
Very cool.
Very cool.
So moving on to some of the issues, I talked about earlier. And by the way, does anybody have any questions at this point? Have anything anything I've raised that you might wonder about? Okay. Well, yeah, go ahead.
Why does there always have to be an alternative? What if the policy or whatever someone's proposing, what if it's just bad policy? Why does there have to be an alternative to bad policy?
Well, if you want to keep the policy the way it is, then you need to support why the policy the way it currently is good and why the new policy is bad. Instead of just saying, I mean, you can say the new policy is bad, but you have to at least give reasons why. And if there is an alternative that's I mean, like saying, okay, for example, raising taxes, we would all agree, I think, that's a bad policy. But it's not enough to just say no on taxes. You've got to be able to say no on taxes, and here's how I propose to balance the budget otherwise. Where am I going to cut? If raising the taxes 1 cent on the tax rate would raise $150,000, then I've at least got to offer to the city manager, here's some possibilities of where we can cut to make up that $150,000. So that's a case where just saying no on a bad policy, you need to offer an alternative to raising taxes. Does that make sense? Okay.
I'm just briefly curious, what kind of law do you practice?
Primarily criminal defense. It's probably 70% criminal defense. The rest is civil, and I actually do some appellate work and domestic and that sort of thing.
Thanks.
So, let's see. Let me check one thing real quick. Let's move some of the issues that have come up with some of the issues I've voted on and the way I've presented alternatives. Again, I discussed involuntary annexation really briefly. Basically, that's the one time they raised the issue of involuntary annexation while I've been on council was one of the few times I took it personally. And I told them, no, we're not, you go down that road and all my niceties and saying let's just move on, that sort of thing is out the window. That's a line that I'm not comfortable with crossing at all. And that was just before they changed the law, so it hasn't really been an issue since then.
Very nice.
But one of the issues that comes up all the time, and it probably comes up in any town you live in, is economic development incentives. Raise your hand if your town or county has dealt with economic incentives. Yeah, everybody. The response that you always get is, well, everybody does it. We've got to do it. The other cities are doing it. The other states are doing it.
Yes, Fred.
And, of course, if you don't know, Google came to Lenoir back in 2007. And the incentives that were given to Google in that case by both the state and county and locally by the city were just massive, basically refunding about 95% of their taxes every year for 30 years. It's about $1.2 million for the city, and we have a $23 million budget, and $1.4 million for the county. Each and every year for the next 30 years. They're now about 6 years into it. And we're going to be raising the tax rate at least 1 cent this year, of course over my objection, and that's one thing I will be reminding them when the time comes. We're raising the tax rate 1 cent. Meanwhile, we just wrote a check to Google for $1.2 million. So, yes?
The tax rate, are you talking about the mill rate? Or?
Yeah, on land, the property tax rate, okay. Yeah. So one thing I've discovered, and I've made these points over and over again every time we've talked about economic incentives, is in case, and you probably know this just intuitively, is corporations choose a location for a myriad of different reasons, and the incentives are only what they ask for at the back end since, we've decided to come here, let's see if we can get some money out of the government. So in the case of Google, for example, their main concerns were that they wanted cheap and available water, cheap and available power, land that was cheap, and then they used, as part of their threat regarding economic incentives, they said, you know, we like this location, there's a power, because the furniture industry has left Lenoir, most of it. I think we've lost about 5,000 jobs in the last decade. We've still got about 3,000 jobs, but we used to have about 8. There was a power substation located right on the tract of land that they wanted to use because these data centers are just enormous. and they're constantly kicking out steam all the time for cooling. So they needed a lot of water, and Lenoir has a very good water system. So after they figured out that we had lots of water, lots of power available to them, they said, well, you need to understand you're competing against a site in New York and a site in South Carolina. And we got to have good incentives if we're going to come to North Carolina. So of course everybody rolled over for them. And the next 2 data centers they built shortly thereafter were in South Carolina and New York. So they weren't putting us off against anyone really, they built them there anyway. Yes?
How many local jobs did that project create?
Well, now they were honest about this, although the city of fathers, etc., didn't make a big deal about this. They said, look, this isn't going to create a lot of jobs. They said this, and we're not going to be hiring probably a lot of local people. We'll hire some local people when it comes to construction, but when it comes to maintaining the data centers, local people will be hired for janitorial and security and that sort of thing. Each data center, I think, and they're very secretive about this, is somewhere between 100 and 200 people. And that's another thing. Often you hear about, well, we as city officials, we're going to make sure that these incentives have clawback provisions to where if they didn't reach their goals, they have to pay the money back in taxes that we had written them checks for. Our deal has no clawback provision whatsoever because they said we're not going to promise any jobs whatsoever because we're hoping to get efficient enough to have even fewer people, which of course is what businesses want to do. They don't want to pay, they don't want to hire employees, they want to run as efficiently as they can on their own without hiring employees. Yes?
So they don't pay any taxes and they didn't hire anyone?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. But the response I always get to that is, well, yes, but before Google was there, we brought in about $40,000 in taxes on all this land, and now we get $80,000 in taxes. So that we get twice as much in taxes because of Google. We don't get $1.2 million in taxes, but so I go around and around on that every time it comes up, and they always concede the point and then vote in favor of it, but you know. And then, of course, in Winston-Salem, they've had experience with the Dell plant, which came, stayed for a few years, and then hit the bricks. And on a slightly different thing, there was the entertainment center in Roanoke Rapids by, what, Dolly Parton's brother? That one was a slightly different tax scheme that got a whole bunch of tax money tied up and then didn't end up doing anything. And there have been several other failures around the state, which I think is making non-libertarian elected officials question these a lot more than they used to. They're not quite as willing to just write a blank check, but it's not stopping. Yes?
Was that NASCAR Museum of Charlotte's a similar type of thing? Or
probably. I'm assuming that was heavily tax incentivized, and it's been a massive failure.
It's never made a dime.
Yeah, it's apparently it's got very low attendance. So another one, and this is something that I've actually debated with libertarians over. Some libertarians think I'm even a little too strident on this issue. Is when it comes to state and federal grants, almost universally I've opposed them at every step of the process. I've heard some libertarians suggest to me that maybe I could compromise if there's 1 or 2 projects a year that the city makes priority. If there's a federal grant available for it, use it. But of course, the problem with federal grants is, for those of us that have thought about it, is it's still tax money and it's still coming out of our pockets. But they always say, well, yes, it's federal tax money. Very little of the grant money is our own money. We're just trying to get back what they took anyway. And of course, what I point out is the same night that we're accepting a $2 million tax grant for $2 million federal grant, there's 700 other communities across the country that are doing the same thing. And when you aggregate all that, it's a big chunk of our own money that's going for, that we're paying to Washington and then getting back for 95 cents on the dollar with strings attached. The other thing that grants will do is anytime, of course, we know this economically, anytime there's a grant available that makes something cheaper than it would be otherwise, it manipulates the system. The city may have a number 1, 2, and 3 priority, but if there's a grant available for number 7, suddenly it becomes number 1, and the other ones get pushed down. So sometimes it has the possible result of making things that really truly should be priorities for the city less prioritized, and eventually that can lead to problems in the future. The other thing that grants will often do is they'll make a project more expensive than it would be otherwise. And I do have to say, that I've been very impressed with the city employees. I think the vast majority of them work very hard, seem to have pride in their work, and they want to do a good job. The department heads are all very competent, but and particularly when it comes to the Public Works Department, there's a number of projects that they've been able to do in-house for cheaper than it would have been to bid it out, since they're already employees anyway, giving them the work of doing this project instead of bidding it out and paying somebody $100,000, $150,000 or something to complete it is often the best way to go. But usually, especially with federal grants, you're required to bid them out. You can't do them in-house. The logic being from the federal government that they want to use it as a driver to build the economy and grow businesses and that sort of thing. And so we can't do it in-house often, and we have to bid it out, usually for more than it would cost the city to do it in-house. And of course, anytime you use these grants, you're ultimately increasing the size of government because you're doing projects that you wouldn't otherwise have done, and it's free money, so people think it doesn't really cost anything, but we all know that it does ultimately. It's coming out of someone's pocket. And what I always say is, and frankly, when it comes to state and federal grants, I've had very little traction in getting a whole lot of some of the issues that I've raised over the years, where I may have started out losing votes 6-1, now I'm losing them 5-2, occasionally 4-3, and every once in a great while I win. But on grants, I don't get any traction, any sympathy anywhere. That never goes anywhere. So it's gotten to the point whenever there's a council that I've been, whenever the fellow members of council, I've been around them long enough that I don't have to go through the whole spiel of what I've just gone over with you. I'll often say, if it's important enough for us to do, we should do it ourselves. And then just wait for the 6-1 vote. Yes?
What's your secret to maintaining the cordial relations and not shooting somebody or yourself?
Well, again, a lot of that has to come with my legal training. I've learned to accept defeat. You know, clients will get convicted when I don't think they should have been. I'll make arguments on motions that I lose, and you always have to be courteous to the court. You can't say, "Judge, you're wrong," and throw a fit in the middle of the courtroom. So I just have discussions with them, try to convince them that, my way is correct and that they should change their votes. But, I'm not going to, like I say, I'm not just going to go home and cry about it, and I'm not going to take it personally because they just have different political views than I do. A little interesting area that, particularly in the last few months, that I've had to deal with is zoning and land use, which again is an issue that we as libertarians have a pretty strong position on. Whenever I discuss, whenever we discuss zoning and how I'm opposed to zoning and those sorts of things, there's always I always hear from them, well, if it weren't for zoning, people would render fat next to residential communities and that sort of thing, or hog slaughterers or whatever it may be. And I point out to them that there's already an area of there's several areas of the law that prevent that sort of thing from going on. Public and private nuisance laws were created centuries before there was zoning to deal with that. If there was something that was legitimately annoying, and especially annoying, or delivered something onto your property, you could file a lawsuit about it to get that stopped. In addition, there are lots of restrictive covenants in place for all sorts of residential and frankly commercial subdivisions as well that put limits on what you can do with your property. Again, from my attorney background and doing title work, I've seen all sorts of restrictive covenants. Some go on for 40 and 50 pages, others go on for a page or two, but there are limitations like only residential uses in a subdivision. So people have used those less often because they're used to the government writing it for them through zoning. But if we didn't have zoning, I think people would go back to that, and groups and people would come together and agree to do that anyway. And one of the things that's better about restrictive covenants than zoning is that, of course, rezonings happen all the time. And so people show up and they want, somebody wants to rezone their property because they're near a commercial area, and a commercial business has offered them a huge amount of money for their property. And so they want to rezone. But everybody that's around them who hasn't gotten that great offer shows up and argues against it because they want to keep the commercial, they want to keep the residential neighborhood, and they don't want to ruin the ambiance they have. And so unlike a contractual agreement through a restrictive covenant, of course, the government can arbitrarily change the zoning just about any time it wants. There are limitations on that called spot zoning, which is where you can't just the law theoretically says in certain areas you can't just do a spot zone of a different zone in a primarily otherwise zone, like you can't put a commercial development in the middle of a residential zone. But there are all sorts of exceptions to that I deal with all the time, called special use, conditional use permits and special use districts and all these sorts of things, where if someone comes in and says, well, you know, I'm going to keep it pretty close to the way the residential neighborhood is, but I'm just going to operate a commercial business here. If you'll just make an exception for me, I'll be able to run my business and everybody will be happy. Well, I disagree with that fundamentally, and so I end up voting against those. Another thing that's come up recently is there was a massive restructuring of our zoning laws, not the zones themselves, but the way the zones are interpreted, and some of the laws that we have, or regulations, including there's a change to criminalizing a lot of the violations. And I was able to point out to them as an attorney that you need to understand, by voting for this criminalization of either a zoning violation or, you know, a public, or something that the city considers a public nuisance just by defining it as such, you're running the risk of somebody actually being arrested. You know, having, ultimately, the police are going to come out, put handcuffs on them and lead them to jail. And they say, well, that's very unlikely to happen. I say, well, yes, it's unlikely to happen, but at some point it's going to happen, and it's usually going to happen to some of the poorest and least able to petition their government folks that are out there, people that are just barely getting by from paycheck to paycheck. They're doing the best they can with their home, but it's just not up to the standards of what the city has arbitrarily established. And you're proposing ultimately to either seize their property or to arrest them. Of course, it's still passed anyway, but these are the sorts of arguments that you have to be prepared to make if you're actually in office and opposing these things. Because again, I don't want it criminalized. Okay, so what? Why is that bad? You've got to be able to back it up with good reasons. Another interesting thing that's come up in land use in Lenoir is we had a big discussion over urban chickens, whether people can have chickens in their backyard. And this is something that's become more and more popular across the state. But it took about 2 or 3 years to finally pass an urban chicken ordinance in the city of Lenoir. 3 different votes.
I think we had some tonight, actually.
Do what?
We think we had some urban chickens tonight.
Urban chicken, not rubber chicken.
Yeah. So the first time there was a vote, it failed 3-4. Then about a year later, one of the 4 nay votes decided he changed his mind, and he was switched over to aye. So I was like, yes, yes, please, let's put this back on. Let's put this back on the calendar. So we brought it up again, and then all of a sudden he changed his mind again. And so he was the one who brought it up, but then voted against it in the first place. He brought up something about the EPA saying that there's problems with chickens causing problems with the groundwater or whatever. And had I been quick enough on my feet, I would have said, you know, we've had domesticated chickens for thousands of years, and we've somehow managed to live, and they've been in our backyards for thousands of years and running around the streets of cities for years and years and years. But I kept sort of, I would post things from the Tour de Coupe, which Raleigh has. I'd post Tour de Coupe postings on his Facebook page, and I'd ask him every few months if he'd changed his mind. And I just kind of, he was the one that I was focusing on. And finally, about 6 months later, he said, "You're right, TJ." So we put it back on the ballot again. And I'd done this every time, but this is one of the things you have to do in terms of researching and preparing. I looked at a whole bunch of cities' websites, and I saw that lots of cities you wouldn't think of, like Davidson and Cary. Cary went through, for those of you that live near Cary or know about it, and years and years and years of fussing and fighting over whether to have urban chickens or not. It just went on forever. And so I read about the fight they'd gone through, and Raleigh has them, and Durham has them, and Chapel Hill has them, and all sorts of cities that you wouldn't think of as being into the urban chicken movement had them. So did all this research on it, looked at all the websites, and then the next thing I did, so I checked out about 10 or 15 cities. I called each and every one of their city planners and said, look, how long have you had the chicken ordinance in effect? What sorts of problems have you had? And almost 2 to 1, they said no problems at all. They said, Some cities had permitting processes, others didn't. Some had fees, some didn't. But they all said, you know, one place said there'd been one complaint, and it turned out it was just two neighbors that were mad at each other and were using the complaint process over urban chickens to fuss at each other. But so I came back to so we finally had the vote, and it passed 5-2. It took forever, and of course I don't. Yeah, so someone else flipped anyway, and my wife was very, very happy. That's one of the few things I've done that she was incredibly proud of me for. She'd wanted urban chickens for years and years and years. That's right, absolutely.
Baby steps.
Yes, baby steps. So another one that I touched on was the issue of taxation, and how it's very easy to say, I will never vote for a tax increase. But it's really hard when you get right into office to actually be able to do that and come up with an alternative. And the first few years I was on council, I would actually, when I would post every tax increase, I would actually come up with a proposal on where I thought things ought to be cut. But after a while, the rest of council and the manager basically said, look, TJ, if that's the way you are, that's fine. If we agree with you, the manager will find out where to make the cuts that are necessary to balance the budget. And you can get into some odd situations, as politics often leads to. The very first year I was in city council, the proposal from the city manager was to raise the tax rate 2 cents per hundred, or 2 cents per thousand, excuse me, 2 cents per thousand on the tax rate. I think it was going to go from 49 to 51, maybe, something like that. And there were 3 members of city council who were in favor of the 2 cent increase. And there are 3 who were in favor of a 1 cent increase. And of course there was me who was in favor of a no cent increase. And the 3 members of council who were in favor of a 1 cent increase were like, TJ, you've got to go with us, because otherwise we're going to go with the 2 cent increase, because there's no way to break this roadblock. And of course I was thinking, well, yeah, you could convince one of the 2 cent people to come over to your side, only get a 1 cent increase. But they really, and I told them, no, I made a promise, I'm not going to vote for a tax increase. So there was actually a 2 cent increase, which actually works, you know, if you think about it, by me not compromising, we resulted in a greater increase that 1 year. But I stuck to my guns, and then for 7 more years we had no tax increase at all. So even though that 1 year there was an increase more, 2 cents more than I would have wanted, the next 7 years at least there wasn't a tax increase at all. I think overall, particularly in the issue of basically the size of the city government and the amount of taxes we charge, it has gone up a little bit. I think we've, so like I say, for 7 years in a row there was no increase. Then 2 years ago there was a 2 cent increase. Last year none. This year looks like there's probably going to be 1. So there's been about, over the 11 years I've been on council, there's probably been a 10% increase in the tax rate. We did have a revaluation in the middle of that, but that actually decreased the values overall in the city. So often when there's a revaluation, values go up and the city doesn't adjust the tax rate, and they get a lot more in taxes, and sort of is a hidden tax increase, but we didn't have that. So yes. That's probably true. They don't pay, of course, they don't pay taxes, so we didn't get any direct benefit from that. But yeah, the federal government pays a lot for the county jail to house federal prisoners. But we've got so many people in jail now that now the county's having to farm them out to other counties because they're just arresting people for all sorts of stuff. But that's a whole other issue about too many people in jail and the drug war on drugs and all that stuff. And I don't have any much authority over that area. I've tried to get the police to stop doing traffic checkpoints and that sort of thing, but that doesn't. I don't get anywhere with that. Yes.
When was your reevaluation done?
11, I believe.
2011.
Yeah, we 2003 was the previous one. You have to do it at least every 8 years. You can do it every 4. And so we had jumping from 2003 to 2011, we had the increase in 2006 and 2007. Then we had the crash from 2008 through 2010, and the effect was almost flat. It went down a little bit over that 8 years. Yeah.
Random roadblocks have been a personal crusade of mine from time to time.
Mm-hmm.
Do you happen to know, as a lawyer, of any case law in North Carolina based on them on Article 1, Section 20, not the 4th Amendment, because I know the federal courts have blessed off on them, Have those checkpoints ever been challenged on the basis of 1.20 in the state constitution?
So,
Which
I'm virtually certain they have. I have researched checkpoints as a criminal defense attorney many times. There's some good case law out there on checkpoints, but unfortunately, particularly at the trial court level, judges are pretty they're pretty willing to let them go through. But they're definitely triable cases. Yeah. Oh, almost done? 2 more minutes? Okay, cool. All right, so let's see. Oh, I'm almost done. A little bit more. So, unfunded and funded mandates. I spent a lot of time pointing out that there's no real difference between the two constitutionally. I think they're both unconstitutional. But they're willing to accept funded mandates because they get more federal money and it lets them do more things. So generally, but I've basically opposed, like I say, I've opposed all those grants because I just think they're wrong.
About unfunded mandates from the state to the local community, like the courthouse?
Well, North Carolina is not what's called a home rule state, which means that the municipalities are a creature of state law and don't have any independent authority on their own. So the cities complain about them, but ultimately we don't have a leg to stand on. If the state directs us to do something, we've got to do it. And that's generally those are the only grants that I'm willing to accept. If the state or the federal government forces us to do something, like it's stormwater or something like that, and we'll fund it, I will accept the grant to do that. But a lot of times stormwater now isn't funded, and the city's proposing to add a $4.25 fee per 1,000 feet of non-permeable surface and to pay for stormwater. And my position on that is, look, I'm not going to vote to increase fees. They say, well, it's a user fee. It's not really a user fee. That's garbage. I'm going to say, look, if the federal government's going to force us to do this, I'm not going to vote to increase fees. We're going to have to come up with some place to cut. And that's going to result in loss of jobs or services, and people are going to complain about it. But I'd rather they complain about not having more government than having to pay more in taxes. But again, that's not going to go anywhere. I'm pretty sure that $4.25 increase is going to go through.
Just one more comment.
Yeah.
The opt-in economic opportunity initiative for the counties. I know you're in city government.
Yeah, I don't know what that is. What is it? Give me a quick rundown.
Well, North Carolina passed a law called the Economic Opportunity Initiative several years ago that counties can opt in.
Are you talking about tier 1 for in terms of state aid to bring in businesses?
I think that's part of it. I'm not sure about, I don't.
Yeah, I'm not sure what
that
is.
Well, it's economic. It's supposedly for economic development.
That sounds like the tier 1. If you're a financially distressed county, theoretically you get a better chance at certain state aid to bring in businesses. And that's one of the reasons Google said they came, because we were a tier 1 county. But I guess that's basically it. So
you've had fun on city council or what? Have you had fun?
Oh yeah, it's been fun. Sometimes I'm banging my head against the wall and I get depressed, but that's all right.
But it's fun when you stop banging your head.
Yeah, that's right.
One last question. Have you had any success in getting libertarians, or at least libertarian open-minded people on city boards and commissions?
Lenoir doesn't have Caldwell County doesn't have a very effective or active libertarian party, so I'm not exactly sure.
Well, you get an opportunity as a council member to say, John Jones should be on the planning commission.
If I knew any libertarians that were interested in being on those commissions, I would definitely push them for whether it's planning board or soil and water or whatever it may be. I would definitely do that.
County,
I got more questions. Are you? You're going to cut me off?
I just have a quick question. When are you up for re-election?
2015. So I don't expect. I'm sure I'll be running for re-election then.
When all this great free money comes in that you keep complaining about, because it has strings attached, what do the strings tend to be like from the feds and the states about?
Well, of course, they're telling you exactly what you can use the money for. So it's a grant for this particular project that I wouldn't think necessarily would be a priority for us. But then there's things about how you have to bid it out and exactly, certain parameters on how it has to be maintained or built or whatever it may be. So.
Yeah, we need to come up.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.